His father paid her bills, kept her secrets, and controlled her life. Then his son walked through the front door, looked her dead in the eyes, and said, "I know what you are to him." That was the night everything changed. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to know. And listen, out of every single place you could be on the internet right now, every rabbit hole, every scroll, every distraction, you chose to be here. That actually means something to me. So thank you. Now let me ask you something with love. How is your day going? Because mine just got a whole lot more interesting now that you're here. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because tomorrow's story is one that's going to have you talking. I promise you that. Now, let's get into it. Simone Alexis Carter had a rule. Actually, she had several, but the most important one, the one she'd written in permanent ink across the back of her mind, was simple. Never mistake comfort for safety. At 31, she'd learned that lesson the hard way, twice. And both times a man with money and a smooth voice had been standing at the center of the wreckage. So when Richard DeVoe came into her life 3 years ago with his tailored suits, his quiet power, and his very deliberate charm, Simone had told herself she knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't naive. She wasn't some wide-eyed girl being off her feet. She was a woman who had made a calculated decision, eyes open, dignity intact. Mostly. Richard was 62, wealthy beyond what most people could picture, and married in the kind of way that was more paperwork than passion. He didn't love his wife. His wife didn't love him. What they had was an arrangement, and Simone had become part of a different kind of arrangement entirely. She didn't like the word mistress. It made her sound like a kept thing, a decoration. So she called herself what she actually was. A woman in a complicated situation who was buying herself time to build something better. She was an interior designer. A good one. Richard's money had helped her open her own firm in Atlanta, Carter and Company Design. And she'd worked herself raw to make sure it stood on its own legs. The firm was real. The talent was real. The success was hers, even if the startup capital had come with strings she didn't always like to think about. She was building her exit. Slowly, quietly. That was the plan. Then Jordan DeVoe walked through her front door on a Thursday evening in October, and every single plan she had made dissolved like sugar in warm rain. She hadn't even known Richard had a son. That alone should have told her something about how carefully Richard controlled information. About his life, about her, about everything. She'd been standing in her kitchen, barefoot on the cold marble floor, a glass of red wine in one hand and her phone in the other, replying to a client email. The apartment was Richard's. A penthouse in Buckhead, all floor-to-ceiling windows and uncomfortable art. But she'd been staying there for the week while her own condo got new flooring installed. The key in the lock didn't alarm her at first. Richard sometimes came by unannounced. But the footsteps were wrong. Heavier, slower. Deliberate in a way that was nothing like Richard's quick, purposeful stride. She looked up, and there he was, 6'2", maybe more. Dark skin, deep like polished mahogany, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their time. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 34, 35. Wearing dark jeans and a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow like he'd just come from somewhere that required effort. There was a duffel bag over one shoulder and a look in his eyes that stopped her cold. Not anger, not surprise. Recognition. Like he'd been expecting her. Like he'd already decided something before he even walked in. Simone straightened slowly, set her wine glass on the counter, and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "Who are you?" His eyes moved across the apartment. The woman's coat on the chair, the second wine glass drying by the sink, the small signs of someone living in a space that wasn't hers. And then they came back to her face. "Jordan DeVoe," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to command a room. "Richard's son." He tilted his head just slightly. "And you must be the woman my father's been hiding." Simone's chin came up. "I'm not hidden. I'm just private." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite amusement, not quite respect, something that lived between the two. He told me about the apartment, Jordan said, dropping his bag near the door like he owned the place. Which, she realized with a slow, cold clarity, he probably one day would. He didn't tell me he'd installed someone in it. Installed, like she was an appliance. I'm staying here temporarily, she said, keeping her voice smooth, her face neutral. Years of navigating Richard's world had taught her how to build a wall out of calm. I wasn't aware he was expecting company. He's not. Jordan moved further into the room, unhurried, and Simone stayed exactly where she was because she refused. Absolutely refused. To back up. He stopped at the island, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough that something warm and entirely inconvenient stirred low in her stomach. I came to talk to him, found out he's in New York until Sunday. His eyes dropped to her wine, then back to her face. But clearly someone's home. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against your skin. I know what you are to him, Jordan said quietly. The words landed like a hand around her throat. Not violent, but firm. Unavoidable. Simone looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen felt smaller than it had an hour ago. The marble beneath her bare feet felt colder. And Jordan DeVoe stood there like he'd said nothing remarkable at all, waiting to see what she would do with it. She picked up her wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and said, "Then you know you should probably call before you come next time." His mouth. God, even his mouth was a problem. Curved, just barely. Just enough. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'll keep showing up unannounced." His gaze dropped, just for half a second, to the line of her collarbone where her silk robe had shifted. When his eyes came back up, they were darker. Seems more interesting that way. Simone's heart did something it had absolutely no business doing. She held his gaze anyway. Because she had rules, and the most important one was this: never let them see you flinch. But standing in that kitchen, barefoot and breathless, with Jordan DeVoe looking at her like she was a question he intended to answer, Simone Alexis Carter felt for the first time in 3 years genuinely afraid. Not of him, of herself. Simone told herself she wasn't going to think about Jordan DeVoe. She was lying, obviously, but she committed to the lie with the kind of discipline that had carried her through harder things than one unsettling man in a kitchen. She'd gone to bed that night with her wine, her locked bedroom door, and a very firm internal lecture about boundaries, self-preservation, and the absolute stupidity of finding Richard DeVoe's son attractive. She'd listed reasons, actual bullet points in her head. It was embarrassing how long the list was. It was more embarrassing that none of it worked. Because at 2 a.m, she'd heard him. Not doing anything alarming, just moving through the apartment. The quiet sound of the refrigerator opening, the low murmur of a television turned down respectfully low, the particular silence of a man who was trying not to disturb someone while also making it clear he had every right to be exactly where he was. She'd stared at her ceiling for 40 minutes. By morning, she'd convinced herself she was fine. Then, she walked out of the bedroom and found Jordan standing at her kitchen counter in nothing but gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt that had no right fitting him the way it did, eating her yogurt. Her yogurt, the expensive mango one she'd specifically bought, with absolutely zero apology on his face. "That's mine," she said. He looked at the spoon, looked at her. "I'll replace it." "That's not the point." "What is the point, Simone?" The way he said her name was a problem, not loud, not performative, just settled. Like he'd been saying it for years and had decided it belonged in his mouth. She crossed to the coffee maker, told herself her silk pajamas were perfectly appropriate morning attire, and pressed the brew button with more force than necessary. "The point is, you don't live here. Neither do you." He set the yogurt down. "But here we both are." She turned to look at him then, because ignoring him clearly wasn't going to be an option, and she needed to establish something. Some kind of firm, professional, unbothered energy that made it obvious she was completely unaffected by the fact that this man was built like a sculptor's apology for every mediocre man that had ever existed. He was watching her with those quiet, steady eyes, not flirtatious exactly, more like assessing. Like she was a problem he found genuinely interesting. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "Until I talk to my father." "And when will that be?" "When he decides to answer my calls." Something shifted in his expression then. Brief, controlled, but she caught it. Whatever Jordan needed to say to Richard, it wasn't small. It wasn't casual. There was something tight underneath all that calm. "So? Could be a few days." Simone stared at him. Jordan almost smiled. "I'll buy more yogurt." They existed in the apartment like two people defusing a bomb. Carefully, deliberately, always aware of where the other one was. Jordan worked from the dining table. Simone worked from the second bedroom she'd converted into a makeshift studio, surrounded by fabric swatches and architectural drawings for a new client project. She told herself the arrangement was manageable, professional even, two adults sharing a space, nothing complicated about it. Except that Jordan had a habit of appearing in doorways, not in a threatening way, more like. He'd materialize, lean against the frame with his arms crossed, and watch her work with this expression that was somewhere between curiosity and something she refused to name. He'd ask questions, real ones, not small talk. He wanted to know why she'd chosen a particular color palette, what it was like to walk into an empty room and see what it could become, whether she ever got it wrong and had to start over. "All the time," she'd said, not looking up from her drawing. "Does it bother you? Starting over?" She'd considered it. "Not anymore. It used to. Now I think starting over is where the real design begins." She'd felt him looking at her for a moment too long after that, felt it on her skin like a slow, warm current. She kept her eyes on her work. It was Wednesday evening when things shifted. Simone had been on a phone call with Richard. Brief, surface level, the kind of conversation that had become their normal. When she'd walked into the living room and found Jordan standing at the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking out at the Atlanta skyline like it had personally disappointed him. She'd ended the call quietly. He'd heard it anyway, his shoulders tensed, just slightly, and she knew he understood who she'd been talking to. "You should know," Jordan said, still facing the window, "that my father isn't who he's told you he is." Simone stayed where she was. "Meaning?" He turned then, and the look on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen him. Something raw underneath all that composure. "He has a way of building a story around himself, a very clean story, the successful businessman, the reasonable man in an unhappy marriage." He paused. "He leaves out the parts that don't fit the image." Her pulse moved through her carefully. "What parts?" Jordan looked at her for a long moment. The city lights scattered behind him, the room half dark, and something in the air between them. The charged, impossible thing that had been building since Thursday. Pulled taut. "There are people after him, Simone." His voice dropped lower. "Not business rivals, not lawyers. People who want something he took from them. And right now," his jaw tightened, "right now, you're living in his apartment, with his name attached to your address, which means they know where I am," she finished. The silence that followed was a different kind than before, not charged with attraction, charged with something colder, something real. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Her voice was steady. "Barely." Jordan set his whiskey glass down slowly, crossed the room toward her in a few unhurried steps and stopped close. Too close, the kind of close that made the room feel like it had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. "Because," he said quietly, "despite every reason I have to walk away from this entire situation," his eyes moved over her face with an honesty that hit her somewhere she hadn't protected well enough, "I can't seem to make myself not care what happens to you." Simone's breath caught. She hated that it did. "You don't even know me," she said. "No." His hand lifted. Slow, deliberate. And his fingers brushed the side of her jaw so lightly it almost wasn't a touch at all. Almost. "But I'm starting to think that's the most dangerous part." She should have stepped back. She should have put 3 feet in a solid wall of common sense between herself and this man who was her arrangement's son, who was standing in his father's apartment, touching her face like she was something worth being careful with. Instead, she stood completely still, heart loud, skin warm. And Jordan. To his credit, or maybe his torment, dropped his hand and stepped back first. "You should think about getting your things out of here," he said, voice returned to its controlled quiet. "I'll help you find somewhere else to stay if you need it, somewhere not connected to him." Simone studied him for a moment. "And if I say no?" The look he gave her was complicated, heavy with something that had no clean name. "Then I stay," he said simply, "until I'm sure you're safe." She didn't sleep much that night either. But this time it wasn't because she was fighting herself. It was because somewhere between his warning and the ghost of his fingertips on her jaw, Simone Carter had realized something quiet and terrifying. Jordan DeVoe wasn't a complication. He was a reckoning. And the worst part of her, the part she'd been starving for 3 years, was desperately, stupidly ready for it. Richard DeVoe called at 7:43 in the morning. Simone knew because she was already awake, sitting at the kitchen island with her second cup of coffee, staring at nothing in particular, doing what she'd been doing since 3 a.m., thinking about a man she had absolutely no business thinking about. She answered on the second ring. Habit. "Good morning." Richard's voice was smooth, polished, the voice of a man who had never once in his life answered a question he didn't want to answer. "How's the apartment?" "Fine," she said. "Comfortable." There was a pause, the kind Richard used when he was deciding how much to say. "I may have forgotten to mention. Jordan might be coming through Atlanta this week. My son. I should have told you sooner." Simone looked up slowly. Jordan was standing in the hallway entrance, leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his eyes on her face. He'd clearly just woken up. Jaw unshaved, wearing only sweatpants again, looking like something designed specifically to test a woman's resolve. He'd heard his father's name. She could tell by the way his jaw had tightened, just slightly, like a door closing on something it didn't want to let out. "He's already here," Simone said. The silence on Richard's end was different from his usual calculated pauses. This one had texture. It had something underneath it that felt almost like panic, wrapped tight in composure. "I see," Richard said finally. "Has he—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Is everything all right?" Simone kept her eyes on Jordan. Jordan kept his eyes on her. Neither of them moved. "Everything's fine, Richard," she said evenly. "We've managed." She ended the call before he could say anything else. Jordan straightened off the wall. "What did he say?" "He asked if everything was all right." She set her phone face down on the counter. "I think what he actually meant was, how much do you know? And how much have you told her?" Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed Jordan's face. "You're perceptive. I've been studying that man for 3 years. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I know how he asks questions without asking them." She paused. "What exactly did he take from these people, Jordan? The ones looking for him?" Jordan moved to the coffee maker, poured himself a cup with the ease of a man making himself at home, which she'd stopped fighting 2 days ago. He leaned back against the counter across from her, mirror image of her posture, and for a moment he just drank his coffee and looked at her like he was measuring something. "My father built his first company on a partnership," he said finally. 20 years ago, 3 men, equal shares. The company made a lot of money in ways that weren't always clean." He paused. "When it was time to take the company public, my father restructured, quietly. The other 2 men got bought out for a fraction of what they were owed. One of them signed the paperwork because he trusted my father." A muscle moved in Jordan's jaw. The other one didn't sign. He disappeared 6 months later. The kitchen went very still. "Disappeared," Simone repeated. "They never found him." Jordan's voice was flat, controlled, but underneath it, she could hear it. Something that had been living in him for a long time, something unresolved and heavy. The man who disappeared had a family, a wife, a daughter. He looked at her steadily. The wife spent 15 years trying to prove what happened. She died without answers 2 years ago. The daughter didn't stop. Simone put her coffee down. Her hands weren't entirely steady. "And this daughter?" "Her name is Naomi Washington," Jordan said. "And she has documents, Simone. Real ones, the kind that don't just ruin a reputation. The kind that put men in prison." He paused. "My father knows she has them. He's been trying to find her before she can use them." "And you?" Simone asked quietly. Whose side are you on? Jordan held her gaze without flinching. My mother loved my father for 30 years, and he treated her like a footnote. He set his mug down. I'm on the side that ends with the truth coming out. The air between them shifted. Not lighter, but different. Like something that had been hidden had just stepped into the open and was blinking in the light. Simone studied him. This man who had shown up uninvited, eaten her yogurt, touched her face like she was made of something fragile, and was now sitting across from her telling her that the man who paid her rent might have had someone killed. I need some air, she said. The building had a rooftop terrace. Simone had discovered it in her first week staying at the apartment and had claimed it as the one place in Buckhead where she could breathe without Richard's money surrounding her on every side. She didn't expect Jordan to follow her. She should have. He came through the rooftop door about 10 minutes after her, jacket on now, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand like he hadn't just detonated something significant in her kitchen. He handed her one without a word and stood beside her at the railing, looking out at Atlanta sprawling gold and gray beneath the October sky. They were quiet for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the part that should have concerned her more than it did. How long have you known? She asked. About my father's business? Jordan exhaled. Long enough. Proof is different from knowing. I've been working with a federal contact quietly for 8 months. He glanced at her. I came here because I needed access to documents he keeps at the apartment in his study. Simone turned to look at him fully. You came here to search his apartment? Yes. And then you found me. And then I found you. His eyes moved over her face in that slow, deliberate way he had. Like he was reading something and wanted to get it exactly right. Which complicated things considerably. I imagine it did, she said, voice dry. More than you know. He said it quietly. Honestly. The kind of honesty that didn't dress itself up or apologize for existing. The wind moved between them, pulling at the edge of her robe. She'd thrown a long cardigan over her silk pajamas and called it an outfit. And Jordan's gaze dropped for just a fraction of a second to the line of her throat, the curve of her collarbone, before returning to her face with a discipline that told her he was working for it. That discipline. The effort of it. Hit her harder than confidence ever could have. Jordan? She said his name, and it felt different in her mouth than she'd expected. Fuller. If I help you find what you're looking for in that study. She held his gaze. What happens to me when Richard finds out? He turned toward her then, fully, and the morning light caught the angles of his face in a way that was profoundly unfair. His hand came up and gripped the railing beside hers. Not touching, just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his skin. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said. Low, certain. I won't let it. You can't promise that. Watch me. The words were quiet, but they landed like a vow. Simone's heart did the thing it kept doing around him. That slow, terrifying lurch, like a step off a curb she hadn't seen coming. She turned back to the skyline, because looking at his face right now felt like looking directly at something she wasn't ready for. The study has a code, she said finally. Richard never told me what it was, but I've seen him enter it. Jordan was very still beside her. You remember it? I'm a designer, she said quietly. I notice patterns. It's 4 digits, month and year of something that matters to him. She paused. I just don't know what. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then, softly. His first company launched in March of 1999. Simone looked at him. 0399, they said at the same time. And then something happened that Simone had not remotely prepared for. Jordan laughed, an actual laugh, low and warm and completely unguarded, the kind that lived in the chest before it reaches the mouth. It transformed his face in a way that was deeply dangerous to her continued emotional stability. She laughed too, couldn't help it. It broke through the tension like a window opening in a locked room. This is insane, she said. Completely, he agreed. But he was still smiling, and the smile was doing things to the general atmosphere that she needed it to stop doing immediately. Their eyes met and held. The laughter faded slowly, the way it does when something more serious is waiting behind it. His gaze dropped to her mouth. Just for a moment. Just long enough. And Simone felt it like a physical thing, like fingertips against her lips without any contact at all. She should step back. She stayed exactly where she was. Simone. Her name in his mouth again. That settled, careful way he said it. When this is over. Don't, she said softly. I haven't said anything yet. I know what you were going to say. Do you? He tilted his head, his knuckle. Just one, barely a touch. Grazed the back of her hand where it rested on the railing. The contact was so slight it could have been the wind. It wasn't the wind. Her breath moved unevenly. She felt that single point of contact spreading up her arm, across her collarbone, into her chest like warm water. Jordan. His name came out quieter than she intended. Yeah, he said, like he felt it too, like he'd been feeling it since Thursday and was tired of pretending otherwise. Neither of them moved. Then his phone rang. He pulled it out with the controlled patience of a man practicing genuine restraint, looked at the screen, and every trace of warmth in his face shut down like a light going out. He turned the screen toward her. Dad. Simone straightened. The rooftop felt colder suddenly, more exposed. Answer it, she said. Jordan looked at her for one more moment. Something unfinished passing between them, something that had no clean edges. And then he answered. Jordan. Richard's voice was tight, controlled anger wrapped in civility. I need you to leave the apartment, now. I'm flying back tonight and we need to talk. Not there. A pause. Alone. Jordan's eyes stayed on Simone's face. I'll be here when you land, Jordan said. We can talk here. Another pause. All three of us, if that's what it takes. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes something irreversible. Richard hung up. Jordan lowered the phone slowly. The muscle in his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was holding something in. He knows, Jordan said. Knows what exactly? Simone asked, though something in her stomach already understood the answer. That I'm not here by accident. Jordan pocketed his phone. His eyes returned to hers, and they were serious now, stripped of everything except honesty. And that whatever is happening between us... His gaze moved over her slowly, deliberately, like a hand pressed flat against a wall to feel what's behind it. He's already decided it's a problem. Simone felt the words settle over her skin. She thought about 3 years, about comfort mistaken for safety, about a man who had paid her bills and called it caring. She thought about 4 days, about stolen yogurt and rooftop mornings, and a laugh she hadn't seen coming. And she made a decision. Then let him think that, she said quietly. Let him come home and let him think whatever he wants. She met Jordan's gaze without flinching. But I want to see what's in that study before he gets here. Something shifted in Jordan's expression, deep, slow, like a tide changing direction. You sure? He asked. Simone picked up her coffee, turned toward the rooftop door. I've been sure about very few things in the last 3 years, she said over her shoulder. This might be the first one. The study door opened on the first try. Tris simpti devindismit devitais. Simone stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand still on the frame, and looked at the room that Richard had never once invited her into in 3 years. Not once. She'd designed every other room in this apartment. Chosen the furniture, selected the art, approved the lighting, and he had kept this one locked like a confession he wasn't ready to make. Now she understood why. Jordan moved past her into the room, his presence steady and deliberate, and she followed him in and closed the door quietly behind them. It was smaller than she'd imagined. Dark wood shelving, a heavy desk that faced the wall. A filing cabinet with a combination lock that Jordan crouched in front of immediately, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this moment far longer than she'd known him. Simone moved to the desk. The surface was clean. Richard was meticulous, always. But the drawer on the left side wasn't fully closed, a half-inch of space, barely nothing. She pulled it open. Folders. Neat labeled, color-coded. She flipped through them with careful fingers. Bank statements, property documents, a folder marked legal. Archived that was thick enough to have real weight. She pulled it out. Jordan, her voice came out lower than she intended. He was at her side in seconds. She opened the folder across the desk surface, and they both leaned over it, close, shoulders almost touching, the warmth of him steady against her left arm. The documents were dated 20 years back, contracts, signatures, and one page. Near the bottom, slightly crumpled like it had been handled many times, that made Jordan go completely still beside her. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Richard from a man named Calvin Washington. You know what we built together. You know what you're doing. I'm asking you one last time. As a partner, as a friend, don't do this. My family depends on this. I have a daughter, Richard. She's 7 years old. The letter ended there, mid-sentence, like it had been interrupted, or like the rest of it had been deliberately destroyed. Jordan's jaw was tight. His breathing was controlled in the way that meant he was managing something significant underneath the surface. Simone watched him read it twice, and the second time she saw something move through his face that broke her heart a little. Not for Richard, but for Jordan, for the version of a son who had probably spent years hoping his father was better than the evidence. Calvin Washington, she said quietly. Naomi's father. Yeah, Jordan's voice was rough at the edges, just slightly, just enough, without thinking. Without measuring it or deciding if it was appropriate or smart, Simone put her hand over his where it rested on the desk. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. She didn't move it. He turned his hand over slowly, and his fingers closed around hers, and they stood like that for a moment. In his father's locked study, holding stolen evidence in each other. And the intimacy of it was quieter and more devastating than anything physical could have been. We need to photograph everything and put it back exactly as we found it, he said finally. I know. She squeezed his hand once, released it. They worked in silence after that, fast, methodical, focused. Jordan photographed each document with his phone while Simone held them steady under the desk lamp. They moved like people who had worked together for years. Reading each other without speaking, adjusting without being asked. It took 40 minutes. Every minute that passed was 1 minute closer to Richard's flight landing. When the filing cabinet was relocked and the desk drawer was back to its precise half-inch gap, Jordan straightened and looked around the room one final time. He'll know someone was in here, Simone said. Probably, but he won't be able to prove it. Jordan looked at her. And by the time he starts asking questions, it won't matter. She nodded, but her stomach was doing something tight and anxious, because this was the point in her experience with powerful men where things stopped being theoretical. I need to pack a bag, she said. Jordan looked at her steadily. Yeah, you do. She was in the bedroom, pulling clothes from the closet with more speed than elegance, when she heard Jordan on the phone in the hallway. His voice was low, but the apartment was quiet enough that she could catch pieces of it. Got everything we need? Yes. Tonight. I'll bring her. She paused, her hands stilled on the dress she was folding. I'll bring her. Not. I'll send her somewhere safe. Not. She'll be fine on her own. I'll bring her. Something warm and terrifying moved through her chest. She went back to packing. She was zipping the bag when she became aware that she was no longer alone in the room. She hadn't heard him move. Jordan was unfairly quiet for a man his size. When she looked up, he was standing in the doorway, shoulder against the frame, watching her with that expression that had no clean category. Not quite protective. Not quite hungry. Something that lived in the complicated space between them where neither of them had been willing to build anything yet. Almost ready, she said. Take your time. She looked at him. You said that to be polite. Your whole body is saying something different. The corner of his mouth moved. My body says a lot of things around you. The air in the room shifted temperature. Simone straightened slowly, the bag at her feet, and they looked at each other across the bedroom that belonged to neither of them, in an apartment that was rapidly becoming the site of everything unraveling. Jordan, she said his name carefully, like handling something she didn't want to drop. Simone. Same careful handling, same awareness. She crossed the room toward him because standing still had stopped being an option. She stopped close. Not touching, but close enough that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the slight unevenness in his breathing that matched her own. After tonight, she said quietly, When Richard gets here and everything goes the way it's going to go. She paused. What happens to us? Jordan looked at her for a long moment. His hand came up. Slow, deliberate, the way he did everything. And his palm curved against the side of her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with a care that made her eyes want to close. There's an us to happen to, he said. It wasn't a question. There's something, she said. I don't know what to call it. Then don't call it anything yet. His forehead dropped to hers. Gentle, unhurried, the intimacy of it so quiet and so complete that she felt it in her spine. Just let it be what it is. Her hands found the front of his shirt, not pulling, just holding. The fabric warm from his skin, his heartbeat steadier than hers and working harder than he'd admit. I don't do this, she whispered. I don't fall into things. Neither do I. His lips were close enough to her forehead that she felt the warmth of his breath against her skin. First time for everything. She laughed, soft, helpless, and he made a low sound in his chest that was half a laugh and half something else entirely, something that pressed against her ribs from the outside in. And then he kissed her. Not rushed, not desperate, the kind of kiss that knows it has time even when it doesn't. Slow and deep and certain, his hand sliding from her cheek into her hair, her fingers tightening in his shirt like a question she'd already decided to stop asking. He kissed her like she was something he'd been patient about, something worth the wait. And Simone felt 3 years of careful distance and deliberate numbness come loose all at once. She kissed him back with everything she'd been holding together. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them moved far. His forehead returned to hers. Her hands were still in his shirt. We need to go, he murmured. I know, she breathed. Neither of them moved for another 10 seconds. They were in the elevator, Simone's bag at her feet and Jordan's hand at the small of her back, when the phone rang. Not Jordan's. Hers. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't recognize, Atlanta area code, she answered cautiously. Ms. Carter? The voice on the other end was a woman's. Calm, precise, carrying a weight that immediately told Simone this was not a casual call. My name is Naomi Washington. I think it's time we met. Simone's breath stopped. Jordan's hand at her back went still. She looked up at him. His expression had shifted into something alert and focused and complicated all at once. How did you get this number? Simone asked. I've been watching this apartment for 2 weeks, Naomi said. I've been watching everyone who comes and goes. A pause. Including Jordan. Another pause, quieter this time, heavier. Including you. Her voice softened slightly. Not warm exactly, but human. Real. Miss Carter, I don't believe you knew what you were involved in. That's why I'm calling you instead of making your life very difficult. Simone looked at Jordan. He gave her the smallest nod. Where do you want to meet? Simone asked. There's a coffee shop on Peachtree, 3 blocks from where you're standing right now. A pause. Come alone. Jordan's jaw tightened. He shook his head firmly. Simone held his gaze. I'll be there in 15 minutes, she said into the phone, but I won't be alone. The pause on the other end stretched long enough to be a decision being made. All right, Naomi said finally, 15 minutes. The call ended. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. Simone picked up her bag. Jordan's hand returned to her back and she was grateful for the solidity of it. For something steady in a night that was moving fast in every direction. She's not dangerous, Jordan said quietly as they crossed the lobby. Naomi, she's not the threat. I know, Simone said. The threat lands at Hartsfield in, she checked her watch, 2 hours. Jordan held the door open for her, and Atlanta's October night pressed against them. Cool, dark, smelling like rain that hadn't arrived yet. Then we have 2 hours, he said. To do what exactly? He looked at her over the roof of the car, and for just a moment, in the amber of the parking garage light, with the night around them and everything about it to catch fire, he looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning room. To make sure, he said quietly, that when he walks through that door tonight, you are completely untouchable. Simone held his gaze, and for the first time in 3 years, maybe longer, she believed someone who said they would protect her. That terrified her more than Richard DeVoe ever had. Naomi Washington was not what Simone expected. She'd built a picture in her mind on the 3-block walk to the coffee shop, someone sharp-edged and battle-worn, carrying 15 years of grief like a weapon she'd learned to aim. And Naomi was those things. But she was also 32 years old, with her father's eyes and her mother's composure, sitting in the back corner of a quiet coffee shop, in a gray coat with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, watching the door like someone who had learned a long time ago that danger usually came through the front. When she saw Jordan, something moved across her face, not hostility, not warmth either, something older than both. When she saw Simone, she simply nodded, like she'd already made her assessment and was moving forward. "Sit down," Naomi said. They sat. She slid a folder across the table without preamble. Jordan opened it. Simone leaned in beside him, her shoulder pressed against his, and looked at what 20 years of one family's destroyed life looked like on paper. It was thorough, devastating, the kind of documented truth that didn't leave room for interpretation or expensive lawyers or Richard DeVoe's particular talent for constructing clean stories over dirty foundations. Bank transfers, forged signatures, a private investigator's report from 15 years ago that named Richard directly in Calvin Washington's disappearance, and at the bottom of the stack, a photograph. Calvin Washington and Richard DeVoe, young and grinning, arms around each other's shoulders outside a building with a sign that read, Apex Development Group, Est 1999. Partners. Friends. Once. Jordan stared at that photograph for a long time. Simone watched him do it and felt the ache of it settle into her own chest. She reached under the table and found his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, tight, grateful, without looking away from the photograph. "I've had these for 8 months," Naomi said quietly. "I've been waiting for the right moment, the right person on the inside." Her eyes moved to Jordan. "When I found out you were making your own moves, I waited to see which direction you'd go." A pause. "You went the right way." "I should have moved faster," Jordan said. "You moved when you could prove something." Naomi's voice was steady. "There's a difference between knowing and being able to end it. Your father knows that better than anyone." She looked at Simone then, direct, unhesitating. "I want to ask you something," Naomi said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right," Simone said. "Did you love him?" The coffee shop was quiet around them. Someone's espresso machine hissed in the background. Jordan's hand stayed around Simone's under the table, and she felt him go very still. Not tense, just listening, just present, giving her the space to answer without standing in the way of it. Simone thought about that, really thought about it, the way she hadn't let herself in 3 years. "No," she said finally. The word was clean, certain. "I think I needed what he offered, and I mistook that for something more complicated than it was." She paused. "But I didn't know about any of this. Your father, what he did." Naomi studied her. "I believe you," she said, and something in her expression settled. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the kind of acknowledgement that opens a door instead of closing one. She pulled out her phone. "My contact at the FBI field office is expecting the documents tonight. By morning, Richard DeVoe's accounts will be frozen and there will be people waiting for him at the airport." Jordan leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "Corroboration." Naomi looked at them both. "You were in the apartment. If there are documents in that study that match what I have..." "We photographed everything," Jordan said. He laid his phone on the table. "All of it." Naomi looked at the phone, then at Jordan, and for the first time, just briefly, her composure showed its seam. Her eyes went bright and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds before returning to the table with her shoulders straight and her hands flat and her voice even. "My mother would have..." She stopped, started again. "Thank you," she said. Simple, complete. Jordan nodded once, the kind of nod that carries more than words do. They were outside on the sidewalk 40 minutes later, the folder tucked under Jordan's arm, the night properly cold now and smelling like the rain had finally decided to commit. Simone stood beside the car and looked up at the sky and took a long, slow breath. It's really over, she said. Not a question, just the feeling of something settling. The hard part, Jordan said, coming to stand beside her. The rest is paperwork and consequences. You say that like paperwork isn't its own kind of war. Fair point. He was close. That particular close that had become its own language between them over 5 days. Close enough to touch, close enough to feel, deliberate and aware. You okay? She considered the question honestly. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 3 years, and someone just told me I'm allowed to exhale. Jordan looked at her for a moment, then quietly. So exhale. She laughed, and it came out soft and unguarded and completely real, and he smiled at the sound of it the way she was starting to understand he smiled at things. Like it got past his defenses before he could decide whether to let it. The first drop of rain landed on her cheek. Then another. Neither of them moved toward the car. Jordan? She turned to face him fully, rain beginning to fall lightly around them, the streetlights turning every drop gold. I need to say something. Say it. I don't know what I'm doing. She held his gaze steadily. With you. With any of this. I'm 31 years old and I just blew up the last 3 years of my life in 5 days, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't terrify me completely. She paused. But I'd also be lying if I said I wanted to go back. Jordan stepped closer. The rain was coming down properly now, soft and steady, soaking into his jacket, catching in her hair. His hand came up to her face. Both hands this time, cradling her jaw with a gentleness that was almost unbearable from a man built the way he was built. I've spent the last 8 months being careful, he said quietly. Controlled, moving pieces, keeping everything at arm's length because that was what the situation required. His thumbs traced her cheekbones slowly. And then I walked into my father's apartment and found you standing barefoot in his kitchen in a silk robe, looking at me like I was a problem you were going to handle. His voice dropped lower, and I thought, this woman is going to be the end of me. That's not romantic, she said, her voice unsteady. No, he agreed. It's better than romantic. It's true. She kissed him first this time. Both hands in his jacket, pulling him down to her, and he came willingly. His arms wrapping around her completely, one hand at the small of her back pressing her against him and the other sliding into her rain-damp hair. And the kiss was nothing like the first one. The first one had been careful, reverent, 2 people acknowledging something quietly. This one was a declaration. Warm and deep and urgent in the best way, the kind of kiss that rearranges something inside you and doesn't apologize for it. She felt him exhale against her mouth like something releasing, felt his hands tighten like he had absolutely no intention of letting go. And she kissed him back with everything she'd decided to stop being afraid of. The rain fell around them and neither of them cared even slightly. When they finally separated, breathing unevenly, foreheads together, his arms still around her and her hands still in his jacket. A car drove past and then someone leaned on the horn twice. Jordan lifted his head, looked at the retreating car. Looked back at her. Atlanta has opinions, Simone said. He laughed. That full, warm, unguarded laugh that she was becoming deeply attached to. And pulled her back in, his lips pressing to her forehead, her temple, the corner of her jaw, with an unhurried tenderness that made her eyes close. Come home with me, he murmured against her hair. My place, not his. She pulled back far enough to look at him. You live in Atlanta. Bought a house in Kirkwood 2 years ago. Something warm moved through his eyes. It has a real kitchen, real coffee, and absolutely no complicated history attached to any of it. Does it have good lighting? He blinked. What? I'm a designer, Jordan. Lighting matters. He stared at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he shook his head with a smile that went all the way to his eyes. I'll let you fix every light in the house. That is genuinely the most attractive thing you've said to me. He opened the car door, laughing, and she got in still smiling, and the rain closed around the car like a curtain coming down on everything that had come before. Richard DeVoe landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 11:47 that night. There were 2 federal agents waiting at the gate. He didn't make a scene, that wasn't his style. He went quietly, smoothly, the way he did everything. With the composure of a man who had been planning for contingencies his whole life and had simply run out of them. Jordan got the call at midnight. He was sitting on his kitchen counter. His real kitchen, in his real house in Kirkwood, warm and unhurried. Watching Simone walk slowly through his living room with her arms crossed and her designer's eye moving over every wall and corner and light fixture with an expression of deep professional assessment. He answered, listened, said 3 words. "Thank you. Good night," and set the phone down. Simone turned from the window, rid his face immediately. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She nodded slowly. Something moved through her expression. Not grief exactly, not for Richard, but the particular quiet that follows the end of something long and complicated. The kind of quiet that is the first sound of something new. She walked toward him. He stayed where he was on the counter, and when she stopped between his knees and looked up at him with rain-damp hair and clear, steady eyes, he thought, not for the first time, but more certainly than before, that Simone Alexis Carter was the most quietly extraordinary person he had ever been in a room with. "I want to redesign your living room," she said. He looked at her. "Right now?" "No." Her hand settled on his knees. "Eventually." Her eyes warmed. "I'm telling you in advance so you're not surprised when I start moving your furniture." His hands covered hers. "Move whatever you want. Careful, I'll hold you to that." "I'm counting on it." She smiled. Slow and real and unhidden, the kind of smile she'd been rationing for 3 years without knowing it. And he leaned down and kissed her softly, once, the kind of kiss that isn't going anywhere and knows it. She pulled back and looked at him, and something passed between them in the silence. Not words, not explanations, just the particular understanding of 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of something else and decided quietly and deliberately that this was where they were staying. "Jordan, your lighting in this kitchen is genuinely terrible." He dropped his forehead to her shoulder, laughing, and she wrapped her arms around him and held on, and the rain tapped softly against the windows of his real house in Kirkwood, and outside the city moved and breathed and carried on, entirely unaware that 2 people inside a warm kitchen had just chosen each other. Completely. Irrevocably. For keeps. And that, right there, was the beginning. Not the end. Just the most important beginning of all.